In the shadowed margins of modern history, one name remains tethered to the idea of forbidden knowledge, ritual magic, and metaphysical terror. To his followers, he was a prophet, an initiated adept, and the founder of a new spiritual law. To his critics, he was a fraud, a deviant, and a danger to civil society. To the press, he was simply known as the wickedest man in the world. This is the incredible story of Aleister Crowley. In this documentary, I aim to chronologically explore as much of this man's life as possible. With how extensive of a life he lived and how much he did, I will aim to touch upon as many details as possible. With that being said, let us begin. Edward Alexander Crowley was born on October 12, 1875, in Royal Leamington Spa, Warwickshire, England, to a devoutly religious family. His parents, Edward Crowley and Emily Bertha Bishop, were members of the Exclusive Brethren, a strict sect of the Plymouth Brethren, a Calvinist-inspired evangelical group that rejected worldly pleasure, formal education, and the established Church of England. The Exclusive Brethren emphasized biblical literalism and the doctrine of total depravity, that all human beings were born sinful and deserving of eternal punishment. His father, a former brewer who had sold his stake in the family business to dedicate himself to evangelical work, preached daily and read scripture aloud with zeal. He viewed the world through a binary lens of saved and damned. Crowley's early exposure to this theology would profoundly shape his later opposition to Christianity. According to the confessions of Aleister Crowley, the young Edward was particularly close to his father and idolized him. That devotion was shattered with a sudden and formative trauma. On March 5, 1887, when Aleister, then still under the name of Edward, was 11 years old, his father died of tongue cancer. The loss devastated the boy and marked a turning point in his psychological development. Left under the guardianship of his mother and a rotating series of tutors and teachers, he began to rebel against the strict moral teachings that had governed his childhood. It was around this time that his mother, frustrated with his increasingly defiant behavior, began to refer to him as the Beast, a reference to the apocalyptic figure from the Book of Revelation. Crowley would later embrace the term, identifying himself as the Beast 666, a calculated provocation against Christianity and its moral authority. Even as a child, Crowley demonstrated a streak of cruelty and a desire to test limits. An infamous anecdote from his boyhood illustrates this. He had heard the common saying that a cat has 9 lives, and in a morbid spirit of inquiry, he decided to find out if it was true. Crowley later claimed that he caught a neighborhood cat and then proceeded to systematically torture and kill the animal by various means. These means included poisoning, hanging, stabbing, throat slitting, bludgeoning, burning, and finally throwing the animal out of a window to see if it could possibly survive. When the mutilated cat at last expired, Crowley concluded with clinical pride that his experiment had been successful in exhausting all 9 of its lives. He would say, "I was genuinely sorry for the animal, but I forced myself to carry out the experiment in the interests of pure science, just as any young boy would." This gruesome episode, shocking as it was, prefigured the callous and transgressive behavior that would later define Crowley's persona. After his father's death, Crowley was sent to a series of boarding schools, including Malvern College and Tonbridge School, both known for their strict discipline and corporal punishment. In the confessions, Crowley recalled these years with loathing. He reported frequent beatings and public humiliations. In particular, he recounted episodes of sadistic abuse by authority figures, including a sadomasochistic undercurrent that would reappear in his adult writings and rituals. While these stories have been corroborated in part by records of corporal punishment practices in British boarding schools during the late 19th century, Crowley's specific claims are unverifiable. However, they do mirror a documented trend of psychological trauma and religious abuse among Victorian youth, particularly those from evangelical households. After her husband's death, Emily Crowley sought to reform her wayward son by deepening his religious education. Crowley's relatives intervened as well. His uncle Tom Bond Bishop, who did not share Emily's extreme strictness, took charge of the boy's schooling for a time. Recognizing that Edward was in poor health and miserable at boarding school, Uncle Tom withdrew him from the Reverend School and arranged for private tutors and a regimen of fresh air to improve his constitution. This period of relative freedom was a godsend to the teenager. Out from under the immediate thumb of the brethren, Crowley discovered hobbies like fishing, bicycling, and his first great passion, mountain climbing. He also finally had access to books beyond the Bible. He devoured literature and poetry, and quickly decided that he wanted to become a poet and adventurer, rather than the pious Christian gentleman that his mother expected him to be. Crowley's teenage years soon became a whirlwind of indulgence and scandal. One of his tutors, an older man named Archibald Douglas, not only educated him in the classics, but also introduced him to worldly vices. Under this tutor's influence, Crowley learned about betting on cards and horse races, and on a trip abroad to Sweden and elsewhere, the 15-year-old was even initiated into the pleasures of sex with women. Crowley later recounted that it was at this age, around 15, that he lost his virginity to a woman in a seaside town, an experience that, in his words, made the nightmare world of Christianity vanish from his shoulders. Discovering the sins of the flesh was a liberation for him. He felt no guilt, only exhilaration. From that point, he rejected his mother's notion that sex was wicked. In fact, Crowley concluded that indulging his sexual urges was natural and healthy. He would later boast that during his university years, he made it a point to hire prostitutes frequently rather than waste time on courtship, bluntly stating that it was more efficient to have his desires satisfied about every 48 hours or so without emotional entanglement. Not surprisingly, Crowley's brazen behavior created domestic crises. In one incident, he seduced the family maid, or parlor maid, in his mother's own bed while his relatives were away. When this was discovered, the maid was summarily fired and cast out. According to Crowley's later colorful account, this unfortunate young woman fell into a life of prostitution and even met a gruesome end at the hands of Jack the Ripper. Crowley further dramatized the episode by claiming that he actually knew the Ripper's true identity years later, identifying him as a black magician named Dunstan, and alleging he had given Crowley 5 blood-soaked ties as macabre trophies. Whether or not any of this was true, what is certain is that Crowley's relatives were horrified by his corrupting influence on the household. To reform him, and likely to protect the family's reputation, Crowley's Uncle Tom and his mother sent him off to reputable boarding schools. He was enrolled at Malvern College in 1892. This did not go well. Crowley lasted only a few terms before leaving under a cloud of controversy. He later claimed that he left Malvern after he was bullied and possibly sexually molested by older boys. True or not, his mother refused to send him back. Crowley then attended Tonbridge School in Kent. At first, he did well there, excelling at chess and enjoying outdoor pursuits like fishing and rock climbing in his spare time. However, during a school holiday, the impulsive teenager visited Glasgow, consorted with a local prostitute, and contracted a venereal disease. When Tonbridge administrators learned of this disgrace, Crowley was asked to leave the school. His formal education seemed to be one disaster after another. After these misadventures, Crowley's family effectively gave up on mainstream schooling for him. In 1893 to 94, he was placed under the tutelage of a private Brethren tutor in Eastbourne, and he also attended some courses at a local college as a day student. Surprisingly, this arrangement worked out better. Freed from the worst constraints of boarding school life, Crowley matured academically. He became an adept chess player, even winning tournaments, and further honed his mountain climbing skills on the cliffs of Beachy Head on the English coast. He was gaining confidence in himself as an individual, no longer just a wayward child, but a young man with passions and talents. In 1895, at the age of 20, Crowley entered Trinity College at Cambridge, one of England's most prestigious universities. By now, he had fully embraced the first name Aleister, a Celtic form of Alexander that he found more melodious and mysterious. At Cambridge, Crowley was ostensibly studying philosophy. The course was called Moral Sciences then, but in reality, he treated his undergraduate years as a chance to pursue his own interests freely. He rented comfortable rooms on campus, which soon overflowed with books of poetry, literature, and esoterica. Crowley rarely attended lectures. Instead, he spent days and nights reading widely, writing poetry, and practicing chess openings. He even joined the university chess club and quickly defeated the club president in his first year. Had he chosen to, Crowley could have become a noted scholar or a champion chess master. Such were his natural gifts and intense will when he focused. But academia could not hold his attention, for a far more compelling destiny was tugging at him: the world of the occult. In the winter of 1896 to 97, Crowley traveled to Stockholm over the Christmas holidays. There, on his last night of the year, New Year's Eve, 1896, he had an overwhelming mystical vision in his hotel room. Crowley described the experience in terms that were both eerie and rapturous. He felt consumed with what he called a magical means of becoming conscious of something inside of himself. This presence seemed pure, exalted, and spiritual, nothing like the religion of his childhood. In that moment, Crowley felt that he had glimpsed his true nature and true purpose. My path had been chosen, he concluded. It is likely he interpreted this as a calling of sorts to explore the secret arts of magic and devote himself to the pursuit of hidden knowledge and power. For a young man chafing at conventional religion, this personal revelation was intoxicating. Crowley returned to Cambridge, convinced that he was destined to become a great adept or magician. By this time, Crowley was already exploring occult literature on his own. He read books on alchemy, ceremonial magic, and the paranormal, but he needed guidance and peers in these studies. In 1898, fortune brought him into contact with several people who could profoundly influence his journey. The first was Gerald Kelly, a Cambridge contemporary who shared Crowley's interest in art and poetry. Gerald's sister would later become Crowley's wife, but in 1898, Kelly was simply a friend and fellow artist. Through Kelly, Crowley began mingling with a bohemian set. He even published his own volume of erotic poems, titled White Stains. That year, a scandalously pornographic work which he had to print privately due to its obscenity, using a pen name. Crowley also bragged that he introduced Gerald Kelly to some basic occult ideas and rituals for fun. While Kelly himself would go on to a very reputable career, he became a celebrated painter and eventually president of Britain's Royal Academy of Arts. Crowley at this stage was still a relatively unknown eccentric, with an appetite for all things taboo. The second significant figure of that year was Oscar Eckenstein, a renowned British mountain climber whom Crowley met through climbing circles. Eckenstein, a tough and accomplished alpinist, mentored Crowley in serious mountaineering techniques. The two men bonded over their shared love of adventure and also a mutual admiration for the writings of Sir Richard Burton, the Victorian explorer who had famously translated Arabian Nights and dabbled in Eastern mysticism. Eckenstein respected Crowley's climbing ability and would later lead the K2 expedition with him. But beyond mountains, Eckenstein's disciplined approach to training may have influenced Crowley's approach to mastering magic. Crowley often compared occult training to athletic or military discipline. Eckenstein was one of the few people in Crowley's life who could give him orders and earn his respect. Most importantly, late in 1898, Crowley encountered George Cecil Jones, a chemist and dedicated occultist who became the gateway to Crowley's formal introduction to magic. Jones practiced ritual magic and alchemy and the tradition of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. At that time, the preeminent secret society for Western magicians. Sensing Crowley's serious interest and perhaps noting his considerable ego, Jones began tutoring him privately in the basics of occult practice at his home in Basingstoke. Crowley proved an eager and apt pupil, and before long, Jones confided that he was a member of an esoteric fraternity known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and he offered to sponsor Crowley for initiation. To Crowley, this was a golden ticket into the world that he craved. On November 18, 1898, at Mark Mason's Hall in London, 23-year-old Aleister Crowley was initiated into the Outer Order of the Golden Dawn. The ceremony was elaborate and theatrical, full of Egyptian symbolism, mystical oaths, robed officers, and scripted challenges. Crowley took on the magical motto, Perdurabo, Latin for, I will endure to the end, the name by which Golden Dawn members would know him. In the candlelit hall, he was addressed as a neophyte and warned that breaking his vows of secrecy could bring terrible curses upon him, with the higher order members informing him that if he did betray his oaths, that a hostile current of energy would be placed in motion against him, and that he would be rendered dead or paralyzed, as if struck by a flash of lightning. Far from being intimidated, Crowley was thrilled. This was exactly the kind of arcane atmosphere that he had imagined. Among the members present were prominent figures like poet W.B. Yeats and actress Florence Farr, which showed Crowley that the society had some illustrious adherents. Crowley embraced the ritual wholeheartedly, later boasting that he had no intention of remaining in the lower grades of the order for long. He immediately set his sights on penetrating the Golden Dawn's highest mysteries. Crowley devoted the next several months to an intense study of the Golden Dawn's curriculum. He mastered complex symbol systems, memorized Enochian magical calls, and practiced daily ritual work. His rapid progress astonished and alarmed some of his peers. By the end of 1898, merely a month after initiation, he had passed examinations to attain several grades, the Zealoter, Theoricus, and Practicus levels in quick succession. In July of 1899, he became a Philosophus, the highest grade of the Golden Dawn's outer order. Normally at this point, a member would have to wait at least 7 months and receive an invitation from the chiefs of the order, led by the mysterious Imperator, who at that time was Samuel Idell McGregor Mathers, to advance into the second inner order. But Crowley was impatient. He knew that Mathers, one of the organization's founders, was based in Paris and was an adept occult scholar. Mathers had translated medieval grimoires like the Key of Solomon and the Book of Abramelin. Crowley also became aware that Mathers was in a precarious position. Leadership struggles and personality conflicts were causing a rift between Mathers and some London members, such as Yeats and Farr. Sensing an opportunity, Crowley went to Paris in May of 1899 to meet Mathers. Mathers, who cut an imposing figure in Highland dress and claimed to be in contact with supernatural secret chiefs, was wary of the gossip he had heard about Crowley. Yet he also needed loyal supporters. Crowley, for his part, was willing to pledge that loyalty and, crucially, to offer financial support, since Mathers lived off patrons. During their meeting, Crowley apparently assured Mathers that the stories of conflicts in London were exaggerated, and that he, Crowley, would back Mathers unequivocally. Mathers agreed to help Crowley bypass the waiting period and personally initiated him into the Second Order, granting him the title of Adeptus Minor in early 1900. Crowley exulted this achievement and returned to London in full Golden Dawn regalia, even wearing a traditional Highland kilt as a flamboyant touch to claim his rightful place among the adepts. What happened next was essentially a magical mutiny when Crowley arrived at the London Temple, located at 36 Blythe Road, to collect the secret manuscripts and regalia of his new grade. The senior members there refused to acknowledge his initiation. They accused Mathers of acting without authority and saw Crowley as an interloper. Outraged and unaccustomed to denial, Crowley decided to fight back. He and Mathers plotted a coup to seize control of the London Temple. Crowley, never one to shrink from drama, put on the persona of Mathers' loyal enforcer. He persuaded the building's landlord to let him in, grandly styling himself as the Lord of Boleskin, and with Mathers' mistress, Elaine Simpson, as an accomplice, they literally changed the locks and took over the space. Over the next few days, Crowley stood guard as various Golden Dawn members arrived in shock to find themselves locked out of their own temple. He demanded they swear allegiance to Mathers as the order's chief if they wanted to enter. The famous poet W.B. Yeats was among those who showed up, furious to confront Crowley. A tense standoff ensued until the police were called. The authorities unceremoniously evicted Crowley and Simpson from the premises, bringing the Battle of Blythe Road to an abrupt end. This escapade effectively destroyed the original Golden Dawn. Mathers was expelled by the London members, and the order splintered into factions. Crowley's time in the Golden Dawn was over as well. In later years, he spoke contemptuously of the Golden Dawn's members, dubbing them a bunch of old women, and worse. But he had gleaned a vast amount of occult knowledge from the group, and made contacts that would serve him well in the future. By the spring of 1900, at just 24 years old, Aleister Crowley had stormed the gates of one of the most important occult orders in the world, and had come away with a trove of mystical lore, and a determination to carve his own path in the occult, and with the intent to answer to no one else's authority but his own. With the Golden Dawn behind him, Crowley turned his attention to broadening his spiritual and worldly experiences. In 1900, he embarked on extensive travels both to satisfy his wanderlust and to continue his magical quest outside the constraints of any order. His first major stop was Mexico. Arriving in Mexico City, Crowley embraced the role of independent magician explorer. He rented a house and soon found both a local mistress to share his bed and a circle of acquaintances to discuss mysticism with. He performed rituals daily and even claimed to experiment with invisibility spells, invoking the god Hippocrates, the Greco-Egyptian deity of silence, to cloak himself from sight. In characteristic fashion, Crowley later boasted that after weeks of practice, he could walk the streets wearing flamboyant clothes, a scarlet cloak, and a golden crown no less, and remain unnoticed by passerby. It's likely this invisibility was more of a metaphor for reaching a trance state, or simply his perception. But to Crowley, it was proof of his growing magical power. Biographers have noted that by this stage in his life, 3 key aspects of Crowley's psychology had fully emerged. First, he had shed virtually all inhibitions, throwing himself into any adventure or vice that struck his fancy. The more extreme or horrible, the better. Second, normal sensations were no longer enough to stimulate him. He craved intense, often bizarre experiences to feel satisfied. For instance, he sometimes sought out sexual partners who were very old or physically repulsive, just to push his own boundaries and fuel his creativity. He found that sleeping with wrinkled and ugly women helped inspire his poetry, as strange as it sounds. Third, Crowley had no respect for the sanctity of anyone's body, including his own. Pain, perversion, endurance of disease or fatigue, all these were just means to magical end for him, to be used or suffered without remorse. These traits would define his exploits in the years to come. While in Mexico, Crowley didn't neglect his other passions. He continued climbing mountains, notably tackling peaks, with his climbing friend Oscar Eckenstein. He also delved into Freemasonry. Crowley loved secret societies of all kinds, and in Mexico City, he successfully convinced local Masonic officials to grant him the 33rd degree of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, essentially an honorary role, since regular English Freemasonry didn't recognize it. Crowley also founded a personal magical lodge he grandly named the Lamp of Invisible Light, consisting basically of himself and one Mexican friend, Don Jesus Medina, who provided the Masonic connections. It was as if Crowley wanted to prove that he could invent his own occult order from scratch, a seed of what he would later attempt with his religion of Thelema. By the end of 1900, Crowley grew restless in Mexico and decided to reunite with his old mentor, Alan Benet, who had since moved to Sri Lanka to become a Buddhist monk. Crowley decided to take an interesting route to get there, however. He traveled through the United States, visiting San Francisco and Hawaii, and then across the Pacific to Ceylon. Then, he met Benet in early of 1901. It had been a couple years since they had seen each other. Benet was living a life of discipline, having traded the smoky London ceremonial magic scene for the tranquil austerity of Buddhist meditation. Crowley respected Benet immensely as one of the few people more versed in occultism than himself. They rented a bungalow in Kandy in the hills of Ceylon, and Crowley spent weeks or months studying under Benet's guidance. This was a different kind of magic, the quiet, inward path of yoga. Crowley learned breath control, concentration, and yogic meditation techniques. He made surprising progress. Benet noted that within a few months, Crowley had achieved a meditative state called dhyana, a condition of rapturous, blinding trance that in Buddhist practice is a significant milestone. Crowley experienced this state in an explosive blend of bliss and violent ecstasy, evidence he felt that he was tapping into a genuinely profound spiritual energy. Eventually, Benet decided to take full Buddhist vows in Burma, and the two magicians parted ways again. Crowley wandered India on his own. A few months later, he paid Benet a visit at the monastery in Burma. Crowley arrived to find a scene that seemed like something out of a mystical tale. Peeking into Benet's quarters, Crowley claimed that he saw his mentor levitating about 5 feet above the floor, deep in trance. Whether literally true or not, this sight left a strong impression on Crowley about the power of Eastern spiritual practices. Nonetheless, Crowley's restless spirit wasn't suited to monastic life. He soon moved on. In the spring of 1902, Crowley converged with Oscar Eckenstein and a team of climbers in India for an audacious goal: the first attempt to climb K2, the second highest mountain in the world. This expedition is a legendary chapter in mountaineering history, and Crowley's role in it was as controversial as one might expect. The team managed to reach about 20,000 feet by early July, an altitude record for the time. But then, misfortune struck. Eckenstein fell ill with malaria, or severe altitude sickness, and Crowley himself was afflicted by snow blindness, temporarily losing vision in the intense glare of the ice. 2 of the other climbers pressed on to about 22,000 feet, but the weather turned treacherous and avalanches threatened. By July 10th of 1902, the expedition aborted the climb. It was a failure in terms of reaching the summit, yet it was the highest humans had lived for such a length of time. Crowley's own behavior during the climb, however, left a dark mark. At one camp, frustrated and ill, Crowley reportedly pulled out a pistol and threatened one of the expedition members in a fit of rage, a shocking breach of camaraderie that other climbers later recounted with horror. This incident cemented his reputation as dangerously unreliable under pressure. Years later, Crowley would try to justify his actions on K2, claiming that he had been weakened by illness. But among serious climbers, Crowley's name now carried a stain. After K2, Crowley regrouped in Paris in late 1902. He briefly visited his old Golden Dawn chief, Mathers, to retrieve some personal items he had left with him, but that meeting devolved into an occult feud. Mathers refused to return Crowley's property, and Crowley believed Mathers might be using magic against him. Crowley claimed that Mathers had sent a female vampire sorceress to attack him, a bizarre story wherein Crowley said that an old woman invited him to tea, then transformed into a young seductress who tried to enchant and possibly kill him. Crowley dramatically described wrestling with this woman, who alternated between a beautiful girl and an old hag. He asserted that he only defeated her by channeling his own willpower and magical energy to force her apparition to wither and flee. Whether this was a hallucination, a bit of creative writing, or an actual confrontation with Mathers' occult emissary, it convinced Crowley that he had bested his former mentor on the astral plane. Soon after, Crowley decided he had had enough of Paris. With characteristic flippancy, he joked that, if given the choice under different circumstances, I would probably have seduced that ugly old woman, the one who had attacked him. But since she came at him as an enemy, he had responded in kind. Crowley returned to his Boleskin estate in Scotland in 1903, eager to start a new chapter of his life. He had purchased Boleskin in 1899, originally intending for it to be his retirement home, but history would have very different plans, indeed. The area where Boleskine House now resides has a history of strange happenings long before Aleister Crowley moved in. The parish of Boleskine was formed in the 13th century. A kirk and graveyard were built in the parish around this time. A succession of ministers ran Boleskin Parish and would travel the area on horseback or on foot in all weather conditions. Minister Thomas Houston was said to have the task of hastily laying animated corpses back in their graves after a devious local wizard had raised the dead in Boleskin graveyard. Boleskine House was built on the site of the kirk, which, according to legend, caught fire during congregation and killed everyone inside. In 1899, Crowley purchased Boleskine House from the Fraser family. The house at that time was known as the Manor of Boleskine and Abertaf, after the name of the local parish. Crowley believed the location was ideal to sequester himself to perform a series of operations known as the sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage, taken from a grimoire called the Book of Abramelin. Crowley had attempted the lengthy and demanding Abramelin ritual, a months-long invocation of one's guardian angel. According to Crowley's own accounts, that ritual had opened the gates to a flood of supernatural phenomena at Boleskine. He claimed to have summoned countless spirits and devils that infested the house and grounds. Servants fled, blaming him for poltergeist activity. A local workman went mad and tried to kill Crowley, and even the butcher had a freak accident that people whispered was due to Crowley's curses. These tales, part truth and part myth, established Crowley as a figure of dark legend in the Scottish Highlands, well before the world at large knew his name. To this day, those who visit the area still say they feel an ancient presence residing there. Even the Loch Ness Monster has been attributed to Crowley's actions, perhaps the result of what he conjured up during the Abramelin rituals. The rituals themselves are very militaristic in their dedication and require waking up at specific hours and subsisting on bread and water, and almost constantly being involved in invocation or prayer. For most anyone, these would be considered extremely difficult to conduct, especially for the long period of time needed. Crowley, ultimately, for one reason or another, would abandon the rituals and not complete them. Many have said this was the beginning of the darkness getting a grip on his very soul. I have personally visited Loch Ness and Boleskine and had my own experiences there, but more on that later. Despite his antisocial persona, Crowley was not immune to human connection. In August of 1903, in a surprising turn of events, he fell in love and married. The bride was Rose Edith Kelly, the sister of his friend Gerald Kelly. The marriage initially began on a lark. Rose was to be forced into an unwanted marriage by her family, and Crowley gallantly offered to marry her himself to save her from that fate. They wed in a hurried civil ceremony in August of 1903 at a registry office in Dingwall near Boleskine. What started as a chivalrous gesture quickly evolved into genuine affection. To Crowley's own surprise, he found that he actually loved Rose. The newlyweds spent the next months at Boleskine, where Rose's presence softened some of Crowley's rough edges. For a brief period, the beast became a doting husband. They went on outdoor excursions, hosted hunting and fishing parties, and even took a winter holiday at the fashionable resort of St. Moritz, where Crowley taught Rose to ski and ice skate. Friends later noted with amusement that Crowley, the iconoclast, genuinely enjoyed playing the country squire and proud father-to-be for a short while. By the end of 1903, Rose was pregnant, and Crowley was eager to travel abroad again. In early 1904, he and Rose journeyed to Cairo, Egypt, which would prove to be the most fateful trip of Crowley's life. Crowley rented an apartment in Cairo and presented himself and Rose in flamboyant style. Always fond of adopting exotic personas, Crowley declared that he was a Prince Shao Kahn, or Prince Haiwakan, and even had calling cards printed for Prince and Princess Shao Kahn. He dressed in oriental finery, a turban studded with diamonds, silken robes, and a gold brooch. Rose, whom he nicknamed Oarda, which is Arabic for rose, went along with these pretenses, riding in a carriage beside her eccentric husband, as servants ran ahead to clear the way through Cairo's streets. The couple indulged in the romantic mystique of Egypt, visiting temples and absorbing the atmosphere of ancient gods, which Crowley loved. At first, Rose showed little interest in Crowley's occult activities, but that changed dramatically in Cairo. On the night of March 16, 1904, Crowley and Rose entered the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid of Giza after bribing a guard for private access. Inside that silent, ancient space, Crowley conducted a ritual invocation of the Egyptian god Thoth, hoping to impress Rose with a spiritual experience. To his astonishment, it was Rose who seemed to go into a trance. In the days that followed, Rose, who had never shown any clairvoyant tendencies before, began telling Crowley that she spoke of the god Horus wanting to communicate. Crowley was skeptical at first that his wife, who had previously barely dabbled in magic, suddenly had become a medium. So he tested her. He took Rose to a museum. He asked her to pick out Horus. Among thousands of artifacts, she correctly identified an image of Horus, even pointing out a particular stele that depicted Horus and bore the exhibit number 666. This convinced Crowley that Rose was channeling a genuine message. Heeding Rose's psychic urging, Crowley performed a ritual on April 8th of 1904 in their apartment near the Bolek Museum. He entered his prepared temple room at noon and, as instructed, began writing down whatever he heard. Crowley experienced a disembodied voice dictating words to him. This happened for 1 hour on April 8th, and again at noon on April 9th and 10th, 3 days in total. The entity speaking identified itself as Ios, the minister of Horus, essentially a messenger of the gods, or what Crowley would later call his holy guardian angel. The voice spoke over Crowley's shoulder. He said it seemed to come from the air behind him, and delivered a cryptic, poetic, and often imperious text. Crowley dutifully wrote every word, ending up with a manuscript in 3 chapters. This scripture proclaimed the advent of a new eon, or age, of humanity, and a new law, Thelema, which is Greek for will. When Crowley organized the dictated material, it was titled The Book of the Law. In this small book, the dramatic essence of Crowley's life's mission was codified. The Book of the Law announced, every man and woman is a star. It declared the central tenet of, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. This was not a license for mere hedonism, as Crowley interpreted it, but rather a mandate to discover one's true will and one's genuine destiny or purpose, and follow it without restriction from outdated morals or authorities. The book spoke in the voices of 3 Egyptian deities, Horus and his consort and predecessor forms, and contained prophetic verses that even Crowley found perplexing. One eerie passage referenced wars and a time of bloody chaos to come. Crowley only later connected this to the world war that erupted a decade later, seeing it as a validation that the book had indeed foretold a new era initiated by fire and violence. The Eon Horus, he believed, had arrived with the Great War as its opening act. In the immediate aftermath, however, Crowley was somewhat confounded by the Book of the Law. Its tone was harsh and its style unlike his own. It challenged him as much as it inspired him. One line commanded, "The study of this book is forbidden, and that he should essentially lock it away." Obeying this odd injunction, or using it as an excuse, Crowley did set the manuscript aside for a while. He performed a few follow-up verifications, one involving the museum stele Rose had pointed out. He dubbed it the Stele of Revealing, and noted with a shiver that it was inventory 666 at the museum. He had the stele's hieroglyphic text translated and found it resonated with the message of his experience. By the summer of 1904, Crowley and a now pregnant Rose returned to Scotland. On July 28, 1904, Rose gave birth to their daughter at Boleskin. In typical grandiose fashion, Crowley gave the child an elaborate name: Nuit Ma Atahur Hakati Sappho Jezebel Lilith Crowley, a string of names referencing goddesses and demons. They called her Nuit, or sometimes Lilith. Locals whispered that Crowley had performed rituals during Rose's labor to invoke spirits. Some even feared he was trying to beget a demonic child. There is an unverified rumor that Crowley did intend his firstborn to be a magical prodigy, and that he may have conducted strange blessings at her birth. In any case, for a short time, Crowley played the role of proud father. He continued writing poetry, completing, for instance, a volume called Snowdrops from a curate's garden at this time, and enjoyed country life. But domestic bliss was not to last long. By 1905, wanderlust and the call of his true will as a prophet of the new law of Thelema stirred within him again. Crowley grew restless and bored with routine family life. The world was waiting for its new eon, and Aleister Crowley was never one to sit still when there were mountains to climb, both literal and metaphorical. In the spring of 1905, Crowley seized on an ambitious new project. He would lead an expedition to climb Kanchenjunga in the Himalayas, the world's third highest peak at over 28,000 feet. This was an even more challenging endeavor than K2, and it appealed to Crowley's ego on multiple levels. Not only would it be a chance at mountaineering glory, but conquering a sacred Himalayan summit also had a spiritual allure for him. However, Crowley's insistence on leading the expedition himself caused his old climbing partner, Eckenstein, to back out. Those who knew Crowley's volatile temperament doubted that he had the prudence to command such a dangerous venture. As one climber put it bluntly, Crowley was a great climber, but far too much of a loose cannon to be a leader. Indeed, Oscar Eckenstein reportedly cited Crowley's K2 gun-waving incident as evidence that Crowley couldn't be trusted with men's lives on a mountain. Undeterred, Crowley cobbled together a team for Kanchenjunga that included 3 experienced Swiss climbers and 1 Italian amateur who had no climbing experience at all. Legend has it that this Italian was a hotel manager whom Crowley befriended on the way. In late summer of 1905, this ill-matched expedition set off for the Himalayan foothills with an entourage of 230 local porters and 7 tons of supplies. Almost from the start, things went awry. The journey to base camp was exhausting and beset with superstition. Many of the native porters became fearful as they ascended, believing Kanchenjunga, with its 5 towering peaks, was guarded by gods who punished trespassers. About halfway up, 130 porters mutinied and refused to go any further. This drastically reduced the support of the climb. Tensions flared within the team as well. The Swiss climbers grew to loathe Crowley's cruel treatment of the porters. He was reportedly berating and whipping the hired men, driving them beyond reasonable limits. Conditions worsened as they climbed. Snow blindness, altitude sickness, and sheer exhaustion decimated morale. One porter slipped and fell 1,500 feet to his death into an abyss. Crowley coldly refused to help retrieve the body, a decision that horrified the others. Soon after, an avalanche thundered down on the camp, killing one of the Swiss climbers and 2 more porters. In the chaos and grief that followed, Aleister Crowley did something unforgivable in the eyes of his companions. He abandoned them. Under cover of night, Crowley left the remaining team members and descended with a few porters to the safety of lower elevations without even confirming whether the others were dead or alive. Eventually, the survivors, badly shaken but alive, also made it down. And when they discovered Crowley's callous retreat, his reputation in the mountaineering community was utterly destroyed. The press got wind of the disaster and Crowley's role in it, and while he did send a telegram to the London Daily Mail giving a self-serving account that blamed the other climbers for incompetence, those who knew the truth called him a coward. One of his teammates confronted Crowley later, asking why he had deserted. Crowley cryptically confessed that, on the mountain, he had been overwhelmed by what he termed Kachinchunga fever. He said he had heard disembodied voices of both the dead and demons, and a mountain spirit that struck such fear into him that, for the first time, Aleister Crowley admitted that he was afraid. He claimed that irrational terror drove him to flee, and he coined the term Kachinchungophobia to describe this spiritual horror. It was an admission of weakness that one rarely heard from Crowley, and it underscores how harrowing the episode was for him. Following the Kachinchunga debacle, Crowley's personal life also reached a breaking point. Around his 30th birthday in October of 1905, he rejoined Rose and baby Lilith, whom he affectionately called Nuit, in Calcutta, India. Perhaps hoping to heal wounds, Crowley decided on an overland journey across China as a family adventure. In late 1905, Aleister, Rose, their little girl, and a small retinue traveled by steamboat up the Irrawaddy River in Burma, and then made a grueling trek on foot and by mule through the highlands into western China. For 4 months, they slogged across difficult terrain. Rose and the toddler were carried in chairs by porters, while Crowley marched ahead. By the time they emerged at the port of Haiphong in French Indochina, which is today in Vietnam, in early 1906, the journey had taken a toll on everyone. During this expedition, Crowley's temperament swung between extremes. At times he was distant and brooding, haunted by the failures and supernatural voices from Kachinchunga. Other times he was explosively angry. He began to treat Rose with undisguised contempt. In her diary, Rose noted that as the days passed, Aleister grew more and more hostile towards her. While he had been physically rough with her in the past, even violent, she mentioned that he once literally threw her mother down a staircase in rage. This new coldness was different. Crowley seemed to have lost all affection for his wife, and even for their child. Rose later recalled that he became utterly obsessed with his invisible mentor, Aiwass, the guardian angel voice from Cairo, to the exclusion of all normal human bonds. She realized that her husband now only cared for his own spiritual destiny and carnal desires with others, and that she and their daughter meant nothing to him. By the end of the China trip, Rose resolved to leave Crowley. In the city of Hanoi in the spring of 1906, Rose Crowley finally parted ways with her husband. Aleister headed off to Hong Kong to rendezvous with his old magical comrade, Elaine Simpson. They spent 12 days there, performing intensive rituals together. And then he voyaged eastward toward Europe via America. Rose returned to Britain with their daughter. Tragically, soon after, little Lilith contacted typhoid fever in Rangoon, perhaps on the voyage home, and died in the summer of 1906. When Crowley arrived in England in late 1906, he was greeted with a telegram bearing the news of his daughter's death. His response was chillingly dispassionate. He showed little or no remorse at the loss. Instead, Crowley blamed Rose, accusing her of negligence. Specifically, he claimed that Rose had failed to properly sterilize the baby's milk bottles, thus causing the illness. This accusation not only added to Rose's crushing guilt and grief, it also ignored Crowley's own abandonment of his family in pursuit of occult glory. Rose's life spiraled downward from this point. She and Crowley reunited briefly at Boleskin in 1907, perhaps in a futile attempt to reconcile or simply to arrange terms, but things only deteriorated further. Crowley had numerous mistresses by now, and he flaunted them in front of Rose. He would bring lovers into their home and, according to Rose, would engage in sexual and sadistic acts with them while forcing her to watch. On some occasions, Rose later recounted with horror, Crowley tied her up by her ankles and hung her upside down in a closet while he entertained other women in their bed. This almost ritualistic cruelty, combined with Crowley's heavy drug use, by then he was experimenting with heroin and cocaine regularly, made life intolerable for Rose. She took to drink heavily. Alcohol became her escape from the nightmares of being Crowley's wife. In February 1907, she did give birth to another child of Crowley's, a daughter named Lola Zaza, but any hope of this child mending their marriage was false. Crowley scarcely paid attention to the new baby, and Rose was too deep in her alcoholic haze to care for the infant. Eventually, in 1909, Rose and Aleister agreed to divorce on the grounds of his adultery, which was beyond dispute. However, Rose's alcoholism led to her commitment in an asylum a couple years later. She spent the rest of her life in and out of institutions, labeled insane, a sad end for the woman who had been the Scarlet Woman of Cairo and co-receiver of the Book of the Law. Rose Edith Kelly would remain in care until her death many years later in 1932. Her mind reportedly broken by alcohol and trauma. By mid-1907, Aleister Crowley had lost a child and a marriage, but he had gained something he considered more important, a mission. Armed with the Book of the Law and fueled by a feeling of destiny, Crowley poured his energy into new magical ventures and began gathering followers who would help solidify his legacy as the Prophet of Thelema. Even as his domestic life disintegrated, Crowley's occult career surged ahead. In 1907, along with his old friend and fellow magician, George Cecil Jones, he founded a new magical order that he envisioned as the successor to the Golden Dawn. He called it the Argenteum Astrum, Latin for Silver Star, usually abbreviated as AA. Unlike the Golden Dawn, which had many established scholars and mages, the AA was largely a vehicle for Crowley's personal spiritual system, Thelema. Crowley and Jones set about recruiting promising individuals into their new order. By this time, Crowley's inheritance was dwindling. A decade of lavish spending on travel, equipment, and self-publishing his works had nearly exhausted his funds. Thus, Crowley the Guru also became Crowley the recruiter of wealthy acolytes. He prowled his old haunts at Cambridge University and in high society, seeking younger men and women of means who could be drawn into his orbit and who could bankroll his endeavors. One of the first significant disciples to join him was Victor Neuburg, a Cambridge poet whom Crowley met in 1908. Neuburg was in his early 20s, impressionable, intelligent, and crucially, from a family with money. Crowley was immediately charmed by Nuremberg's poetic soul and willingness to explore. He soon brought Victor to Paris for an intensive retreat as a probationer in the AA. Nuremberg, who was a homosexual, or at least sexually fluid, found himself utterly captivated by Crowley. In a frank recollection later, Nuremberg said, "In my mind, Aleister Crowley was a master. I'd read some of his works before I met him, and I was absolutely fascinated by the man." Crowley became Nuremberg's lover, guru, and taskmaster. During their time together in 1908 to 09, Crowley thoroughly indoctrinated Victor into his creed. He even showed Nuremberg a draft of a new manifesto he was formulating. Essentially, Crowley's plan was to raise an army of young Thelemites who would transform society. In one passionate exhortation, which Crowley wrote and had Nuremberg disseminate, Crowley proclaimed, "Let this book be assiduously circulated among the young. Let me seduce the boys of England. Then these boys, becoming men, may bring about the new heaven and the new earth." He urged a transvaluation of values, echoing Nietzsche, and positioned himself as a general in need of an army of youth, declaring with typical ego that he was a Napoleon of St. Helena awaiting his chance, and that those who clung to old Christian morals were the enemy. Crowley's rhetoric was revolutionary. He literally wanted to overturn the established moral order and replace it with the law of Thelema, and he believed this would require indoctrinating the next generation. Nuremberg, enthralled, agreed to help. In 1908 and 1909, Crowley took Nuremberg on an arduous walking tour through Spain and North Africa. This journey doubled as both a romantic adventure and a rigorous magical apprenticeship. Crowley trained Victor in the principles of living life as a magician. Among the maxims Crowley imparted were, always maintain the manners of a gentleman, never charge money for teaching magic, ironic given Crowley's reliance on followers' funds, and never claim something you cannot prove, uphold the dignity of the art with a balance of science and philosophy, and never pretend to be more than you are. These were ideals that Crowley himself struggled to adhere to, but he sincerely wanted Nuremberg to embody them. By the end of their trek, Nuremberg was utterly devoted. Before they parted, Victor took a formal vow of holy obedience to Crowley, swearing to follow Crowley's guidance in all matters magical. It was a pledge that Nuremberg later admitted was incredibly difficult to keep, as Crowley's demands grew more and more extreme. By the summer of 1909, back at Boleskin, Crowley felt everything was coming together. He launched a new periodical, the Equinox, subtitled The Review of Scientific Illuminism, which served as the official organ of the AA. Through the Equinox, Crowley published rituals, essays, poetry, and magical records, spreading the doctrine of Thelema in a series of hefty biannual volumes that went out to libraries, subscribers, and occult enthusiasts. This gave his movement a veneer of legitimacy and a means of outreach. Then, fate handed Crowley a powerful symbol. In the process of moving out of Boleskin later in 1909, he stumbled upon the misplaced manuscript of the Book of the Law. He had it packed away and had forgotten it for 5 years. Rediscovering it amidst the paper struck Crowley as a sign. He had started 1909 strong. The Equinox was garnering attention, but finding the law again electrified him. It all seemed to make perfect sense, he wrote. The prophecy that he was the chosen one to announce a new age felt undeniable now. Crowley realized he had, in a fit of doubt, been neglecting the very scripture that had legitimized his mission. With renewed fervor, he committed to devoting his life to Thelema and to Ayahuasca, the guiding spirit behind it. Immediately, Crowley undertook a series of magical workings to align himself with this purpose. He invited Nuremberg to join him in what he termed a magical retirement, an intensive period of ritual, meditation, and experimentation secluded from the outside world. They chose to conduct this retreat in the summer and fall of 1909, partly in London and partly in the North African desert. Before leaving London, Nerberg endured 2 weeks of isolation and yogic disciplines to purify himself. Crowley, who had separate living quarters from Rose by then, would summon Victor at night for secret ceremonies. Nerberg recounted that Crowley was a harsh master, a sadist as well as a masochist, who forced him to undergo grueling trials, such as spending nights lying on a cold stone floor with minimal clothing and comfort to break down his ego. It was all framed as part of Nerberg's initiation, and indeed, by the end of it, he was formally initiated as a neophyte of the AA. Meanwhile, Crowley's marriage to Rose officially ended in 1909 amidst this flurry of activity. Rose agreed to divorce him on grounds of adultery, which was merely a legal formality, but she was by then relieved to be free of him. Crowley ensured Rose would have a small allowance and that their surviving daughter, Lola Zaza, would be provided for. Unfortunately, as previously mentioned, Rose's alcoholism only worsened afterward, leading to her committal in 1911. Crowley noted her decline with cold detachment and even a hint of vindication, as if her fate was proof of what happens to those who can't handle the energies he unleashed. With Rose gone, Crowley was fully encumbered and free to pursue the next great magical adventure, the infamous desert workings with Victor Nerberg in Algeria. In late 1909, Crowley and Nerberg traveled deep into the Sahara to invoke the Enochian Aethers, 30 tiers of astral realms described in the writings of Magus John Dee. This was an extraordinarily dangerous and ambitious series of rituals. They wandered from oasis to oasis, performing intense ceremonies to scry each Aether in succession. Crowley had by now adopted another magical persona. As the head of the AA, he styled himself Prince Cherubim at times, but more lastingly, he was known as Master Therion. Therion being Greek for Great Beast, and also took the title Baphomet within another order, the OTO, which he was about to enter. In the Algerian villages, to blend in with the local Muslim population, Crowley grew a beard, wore an elaborate turban, and prominently displayed a large jeweled ring, the image of a powerful sorcerer. He even had Nerberg shave his head and play the part of a servant companion. By some accounts, Crowley would lead Nerberg around on a leash like a pet dog, further shocking onlookers. This bizarre theater was both for their safety, making locals fear them too much to interfere, and for Crowley's ego. He delighted in being the great beast in the flesh. The magical operations in the desert were some of the most intense Crowley had ever performed. For one, Crowley and Nerberg engaged in ritual sex magic repeatedly during their journey, merging their sexual energies to fuel visions. In one rite that Crowley dubbed the Rite of Pan, Nerberg took the active or masculine role, while Crowley was the passive partner. This formalized what was already a sexual relationship into a magical sacrament. Crowley believed combining sex, even in forms considered perverse by society, with ceremonial magic could unlock tremendous occult force. He would become notorious for these practices, but in 1909, it was all secret work between him and Victor. The culmination of their expedition was Crowley's attempt to invoke Choronzon, the dreaded demon of the 10th Aether, whom the Golden Dawn teachings identified as the personification of chaos and dispersion. On December 6, 1909, in a remote spot in the desert, Crowley prepared a protective circle and a triangle for the spirit. Normally, the magician would stay in the circle, and the scryer or medium would sit in the triangle to receive the spirit, the triangle being the dangerous spot. In a typically arrogant move, Crowley decided to invert protocol. he would enter the triangle himself and confront Choronzon directly, while Nuremberg remained armed with a magical dagger in the circle to witness and record what transpired. Before beginning, they slaughtered 3 pigeons and spread their blood at the triangle's points, an offering to draw the demon in. Crowley clad himself in a black robe and hood, and then stepped into the triangle, armed only with a ritual dagger and his will. What followed was a harrowing ordeal that nearly shattered Nuremberg's sanity. As he later recounted, with some prompting from Crowley's own written record of the event, Choronzon manifested as a chaotic, shape-shifting presence that attacked Crowley viciously. At one point, Crowley became quiet and then lunged out of the triangle at Victor, seemingly possessed and trying to maul him. Nuremberg, terrified but loyal, struck Crowley to subdue him and forced him back into the triangle. Crowley writhed and babbled in multiple voices. One moment, a seductive woman, the next, a feral beast, as Choronzon attempted to break free through him. Nuremberg feared for his life. He truly thought the demon might kill them both. Victor invoked the names of Crowley's guiding angel Aiwass for protection and brandished the dagger. In the struggle, the sand was disturbed, breaking parts of the protective circle, a very dire turn in magical practice. Yet ultimately, after what felt like an eternity of nightmare, the entity was banished. Choronzon slithered back to whence he came, as Crowley put it. Both men were left exhausted and shaken. Crowley, remarkably, considered the operation a grand success. They had confronted the very abyss of the soul and survived. Nuremberg achieved the exalted grade of Magister Templi, or Master of the Temple, a high level in Crowley's system, as a result of enduring all 30 aethers with Crowley. In a triumphant letter to his friend, Captain JFC Fuller, Crowley proclaimed, "We have the apocalypse beaten to a frazzle. It was the holiest event of my life." Returning to civilization, Crowley realized he had achieved a new plateau of notoriety and mastery, but it came at a cost. Victor Nuremberg, loyal and strong as he was, had been deeply scarred by the experience. Crowley pushed him further, even toying with the idea of a human sacrifice as the supreme rite of magic during their discussions. They concluded it was too immoral and dangerous, essentially black magic, and claimed that they never attempted it. Crowley's journals from that time also mentioned that during one of the Algerian rituals, he had a vivid past life memory of being a priestess prostitute in ancient Rome, which only enforced his belief in the continuity of his soul's journey toward enlightenment. Meanwhile, Nuremberg's finances were being strained by Crowley's demands. Crowley had been living off of Victor's inheritance during their travels, and even Nuremberg's mother received a suspicious letter from Crowley at one point, implying that she should send £500 if she wanted to see her son safe. Nuremberg couldn't be sure if Crowley actually attempted to ransom him, or if it was just a misunderstanding, but it planted a seed of distrust. By the time they left Paris to head home in early 1910, Victor Nuremberg was near a nervous collapse. Gathering his courage, Nuremberg finally told Crowley he needed to end their association. Crowley, surprisingly, did not stop him. Perhaps he sensed that Nuremberg had given all he could, and they parted ways. Nuremberg later described living in fear of the beast for years after. The psychic terror of Crowley's hold on him lingered long after their friendship ended. Crowley, for his part, was sad to lose Victor, who had been a genuine friend and lover, but he quickly rationalized it as the inevitable result of pushing a student to their limits. By 1910, Aleister Crowley stood at the height of his youthful powers. He had transformed himself from a rebellious Christian boy into a famed occultist who had opened the gates of the apocalypse, and as he saw it, declared a new law for humanity. The next phase of his life would test how far society would tolerate the self-proclaimed great beast, as his penchant for scandal and controversy only grew in the years leading up to the First World War. Aleister Crowley spent the years 1910 to 1914 consolidating his status as the world's most notorious occultist. This period saw him actively courting publicity, often infamy, and engaging in flamboyant activities that attracted journalists' attention. At the same time, he continued refining his occult practices and expanding his influence through new alliances. One of Crowley's first public ventures in this era was a series of occult theatrical performances known as The Rites of Ulysses in London in 1910. These were 7 ritualistic plays devised by Crowley, each centered on a classical planet and corresponding deity, intended to invoke spiritual states in the audience. Ever the showman, Crowley rented Caxton Hall in Westminster and staged the rites on consecutive nights, charging admission to the curious public. He, along with his lover, Leela Vadel, a striking Australian violinist, and a few other assistants, performed poetry, music, and dramatic invocations under dim-colored lights and thick clouds of incense. The aim was partially genuine. Crowley hoped to enlighten attendees with glimpses of mystical ecstasy, but also practical. He needed to raise money through ticket sales and gain new followers. The press, however, was not kind. A reporter from a society paper called The Looking Glass attended and published a scathing review, calling the performances coarse, vulgar, and gibberish, and heavily insinuating that Crowley and his inner circle were depraved. The article specifically mentioned Crowley's close associate, George Cecil Jones, and accused Jones and Crowley of participating in unmentionable immoralities. This public besmirching of Jones's name outraged him. Jones sued the newspaper for libel in 1911, determined to clear his reputation. The libel trial also turned into a fiasco, largely because of Crowley's fearsome reputation. Crowley was not called to testify by either side, likely a deliberate choice, as having the wicked Crowley speak might do more harm than good to Jones's case. Instead, the defense attorney painted Crowley as the loathsome and abominable creature, effectively arguing that if Jones was associated with Crowley, the newspaper had every reason to assume immoral behavior. The weight of evidence was less important than the aura of evil that Crowley carried. In the end, George Cecil Jones lost the libel suit, a severe blow to him personally and financially. The judge essentially said that, given Crowley's track record, the paper's comments weren't beyond reason. This outcome demonstrated the danger of being publicly linked to Aleister Crowley. For Crowley, it had immediate consequences. Captain J.F.C. Fuller, one of his prominent followers and a patron of his Equinox periodical, was among those who now distanced themselves. Crowley's pool of benefactors in England shrank, and he realized that his own notoriety could financially sink the AA if he wasn't careful. In his diary, he coolly observed that perhaps time had come for him to bow out as the visible leader of the AA, to let it operate more in the shadows while he pursued other avenues. In truth, Crowley never relinquished control, but he did start looking for a new occult platform that might be more resilient to bad press. Around this same time, Crowley's love life evolved in typically unconventional fashion. He continued living with Leela Vadel for a while. She remained his lover and muse through the Ulysses period, but she was not as enthusiastic about diving into the darkest corner of ritual as Crowley might have liked. Crowley still engaged in casual affairs and homosexual encounters, seeing them as normal extensions of his magical practice. Sex was sacrament, not sin in his philosophy. In late 1911, Crowley met Mary Dempsey, an Irish-American woman with a formidable personality. Mary was married. Her surname Dempsey came from her estranged husband. But Crowley was instantly drawn to her, calling her in private his new Scarlet Woman, the successor to Rose. Mary Dempsey matched Crowley's intensity and did not recoil from his occult interests. They plunged into an affair that was passionate and also productive. Mary became Crowley's magical partner in a series of experiments in 1912. Crowley and Mary traveled to Switzerland together, where they undertook rituals involving narcotic drugs and intense visualization. Mary, who had a teenage son, Preston, from her marriage, served as a medium for Crowley during these rites and reported powerful hallucinations. At times, she manifested what Crowley interpreted as ancient pagan deities speaking through her. Crowley recorded these communications and later published them as parts of Book 4, his magnum opus on magic. It was in Book 4 that Crowley first publicly used the spelling magic, with a K, to distinguish the spiritual practice from stage illusion or superstition. This spelling has since become standard usage in occult circles, directly due to Crowley's influence. After Switzerland, Crowley and Mary moved on to France and then Italy in late 1912. Their plan was to rent a villa and continue intensive sex magical workings. However, a complication arose. Mary's son, Preston Sturgis, who was 13. He came to join his mother for the Christmas holidays. The presence of a child was inconvenient, but they attempted to keep their activities discreet around him. Preston, who would later become a famous Hollywood film director, wrote about this experience in his memoirs. He recalled that Crowley made a dreadful impression on him. One disturbing thing the boy witnessed was Crowley's habit of cutting himself on the arm with a knife every time he violated a self-imposed rule of mental discipline. Crowley was practicing a form of ritual penance or conditioning. Every time he caught himself saying "I" or having egotistical thoughts, he'd slash his forearm, a technique he'd advocated to others for curbing the ego. Seeing this bloody behavior terrified Preston. As the days went on, tension between Crowley and the boy escalated. Preston later wrote, "My mother and I were lucky to escape with our lives. If I had been a little older, Crowley might not have escaped with his." This chilling line suggests that Preston believed Crowley was dangerous enough to kill them, or that he himself might have tried to kill Crowley if he had been capable. The boy convinced his mother to flee. The affair with Mary Dempsey ended predictably in May of 1912, amid acrimony, with Mary and Preston sailing back to America. Preston Sturgis indeed survived to adulthood and became a renowned movie director. But he never forgot the trauma of Aleister Crowley's company, painting him as a villain in his autobiography. Crowley returned to London in mid-1912 and patched things up with Leela Vadel for a time. He also took up residence at 2 Avenue Studios in Fulham, which became a new base of operations. It was around this time that Crowley had a fateful encounter with a secretive German occult order that would significantly impact his future. The Ordo Templi Orientis, or the OTO, was a continental European magical fraternity that included esoteric Freemasonry and tantric sexual practices in its highest degrees. Its leader was Theodor Reuss. In late 1912, Reuss approached Crowley with a serious accusation. Crowley, in writing the Book of Lies, a short cryptic book he had published earlier that year, had supposedly revealed the great secret of the OTO without permission. Crowley was perplexed. He had not been aware of any OTO secrets specifically. Reuss pointed to a particular chapter of the Book of Lies that, when interpreted in a certain way, gave hints about using sexual energy in magic. Specifically, a veiled reference to sex between a man and a woman as a sacrament. Crowley realized that this was indeed likely the hidden secret of the OTO's inner teachings, that sexual magic was the key to the highest initiation. Crowley protested that his use of it was coincidental, but inwardly he was delighted. In his diary, he wrote, "It instantly flashed upon me the entire symbolism of Freemasonry and many other traditions. It blazed upon my spiritual vision." He felt as if a puzzle piece had clicked, confirming that sexual force was the supreme magical power, something he had already been exploring on his own. The upshot was that the OTO decided to recruit rather than punish Crowley. Recognizing his charisma and knowledge, Rus initiated Crowley into the OTO's highest degrees. By 1913, Crowley was appointed National Grand Master General of the OTO for Great Britain and Ireland. He took the mystical title Baphomet within the order, Baphomet being a controversial idol figure associated with the Knights Templar and black magic. Crowley also made sure to integrate his own law of Thelema into the OTO's system. For instance, requiring that every initiate possess a copy of the Book of the Law. Effectively, Crowley hijacked the British branch of OTO and used it as another platform to spread Thelema. The Germans tolerated this because Crowley was enthusiastic, and they likely thought his notoriety could be an asset. Having OTO authority also gave Crowley a new pretext for his favorite activities. Sexual magic was the core of the OTO's secret teachings, and now Crowley had a license to practice it openly within a structured initiatory framework. In 1913, he and Layla Vadel and possibly other members embarked on another unusual public venture. They staged an occult-themed performance in Moscow of all places. Crowley formed a troupe of ragged ragtime girls, basically a small group of female violinists and dancers led by Leela, and put on a show that blended music hall entertainment with hints of mysticism. The Moscow engagement was short-lived. Crowley wasn't a great impersonario. Russian audiences were bemused by the mix of ragtime music and occult posturing, but this didn't last for long. Crowley lost money and patience and abandoned the troupe in Moscow after a while. However, he used his downtime there fruitfully. He wrote the Gnostic Mass in Moscow, a ritual that would become a central liturgy in the OTO and is still performed by Thelemic groups today. He also penned his famous Hymn to Pan, an ecstatic pagan poem, during that stay. Crowley's diary from Moscow also mentions a dark romantic fling. He met a Hungarian girl named Annie Ringler, who shared his taste for sadomasochistic sex. Despite language barriers, she spoke only Hungarian and a little bit of German. He spoke English and some broken German. They communicated through the language of flesh, as Crowley put it. He would go on to say that Annie had a passion for pain, and Crowley was more than happy to indulge her by inflicting his own brand of physical cruelty. This intense affair, excruciating pleasure he called it, apparently inspired some of Crowley's creative output of the time. It also reinforced his conviction that exploring extremes of physical sensation could unlock occult inspiration. After a few months, bored with playing theatrical producer and drained by the debaucheries of Moscow, Crowley returned to London in 1913. Back in England, Crowley put the finishing touches on the Gnostic Mass. The Gnostic Mass was essentially Crowley's church ceremony for Thelema, a ritual loosely based on the Catholic Mass, but with a decidedly unorthodox twist. It celebrated the union of male and female, priest and priestess, as a symbol of cosmic creative power. In private performances of the Mass, the priestess would be naked at certain points, and sexual fluids were symbolically or literally consumed as sacraments. Crowley's script for the Mass included lines where the priestess is unveiled and embraced intimately by the priest. in countries where public decency laws were stricter, like puritanical England or America. He allowed the priestess to cover herself before the priest's embrace. But Crowley's preferred mode was to do the rite without such modesty, sometimes in private temple settings. But designing the Gnostic Mass, Crowley had effectively created a formal religious service for Thelema, one that combined his fascination with sex, drama, and mysticism. As 1914 approached, Crowley was juggling many roles: prophet of Thelema, head of the British OTO, prolific writer and poet, and a figure of scandal watched by the press. Despite financial ups and downs, he managed to sustain his work through donations and clever schemes. But larger events were looming. The outbreak of World War I in the summer of 1914 would soon provide Crowley with a new stage. Unexpectedly, across the Atlantic in the United States, and a chance to reinvent himself yet again, even as it spelled the end of the era of Edwardian occult societies in which he had so thrived. When World War I erupted in August of 1914, Aleister Crowley was in London, and notably, he was broke. His extravagant lifestyle and constant occult projects had drained his resources. Moreover, with Europe plunged into conflict, his usual network of occult acquaintances was disrupted. Crowley made a bold decision. He would sail to New York City and try his luck in America. Ostensibly, he claimed he was going to promote Thelema and seek publishing opportunities. But some suspected he was also quietly avoiding any possibility of being drafted or entangled in the war effort. As a 39-year-old foreign national, the latter was unlikely, but Crowley often gave multiple explanations for his moves. Crowley departed for the U.S. in October of 1914, crossing on the Lusitania, the famed luxury liner, later sunk by a U-boat in 1915. Though Crowley's voyage was uneventful. He arrived in New York nearly penniless, carrying only about 50 pounds and a trove of manuscripts and magical notebooks. For the first time in his life, Crowley faced living in a new city without guaranteed income or a rich patron to lean on. But he did have one valuable asset: infamy. Unbeknownst to him, a New York tabloid called The World had already published an article about him shortly before his arrival. The story gleefully recounted lurid tales from London of Crowley's satanic exploits, with aristocratic women at his Fulham studio. It highlighted his intensely magnetic personality that either attracted or repelled with equal force. And it detailed bizarre habits, like his serpent's kiss, an affection where Crowley had purportedly filed 2 of his teeth to sharp points and would bite a woman's hand upon introduction to draw blood. According to the article, Crowley explained this biting as a way of infecting her with my power. Whether Crowley ever actually bit strangers as a greeting is debatable. It sounds like an exaggerated anecdote, but who knows, he might have. But the press loved the imagery of a literal vampiric Englishman in their midst. In any case, by the time Crowley stepped off the gangplank in New York, he found that in some of the city's avant-garde circles, they were already whispering about this wickedest man who had come to town. Crowley realized there was potential here. America had a thriving, if small, occult subculture. Spiritualists, theosophists, and various esoteric groups existed in cities like New York and Los Angeles. And because the U.S. was neutral in the war initially, it was a gathering place for expatriates and exiles from Europe. Settling into Greenwich Village, the bohemian heart of Manhattan, Crowley quickly made acquaintances. He continued his sexual and magical practices unabated. In fact, he later wrote in his diary that, during his early months in New York, he engaged in advanced OTO workings. The 9th degree in the OTO being sex magic, of the most direct sort. He hired or befriended prostitutes to serve as his ritual partners, or scarlet women, in these ceremonies. Crowley's American diaries, later partially published, recount he invoked various deities while having sexual intercourse, using these magical operations. He also visited the Turkish baths in New York, where he had plenty of homosexual encounters. Again, writing that these were done in the context of magical experimentation. Crowley even notes that, matter-of-factly, he rarely indulged in sex for mere pleasure during this period. Every coupling was, to him, a form of magical work. It's worth noting that Crowley was somewhat ahead of his time in openly embracing bisexuality and alternative lifestyles, in an era where such things were taboo or outright illegal. He truly did live by do what thou wilt in that regard. Crowley's need for an income pushed him into a curious role in America, that of propagandist. Early in 1915, he crossed paths with George Sylvester Viereck, a German-American poet and publicist who was ardently pro-German. Viereck was working for the German propaganda office in the United States, trying to keep American public opinion neutral or favorable to Germany. This was before America entered the war. Perhaps seeing an opportunity for mischief, or perhaps influenced by a contrary streak, Crowley volunteered himself to Viereck as an ally, but he did so under false pretenses. Crowley told Viereck that he was of Irish descent and an Irish patriot opposed to British rule. This was a deceit. While Crowley had some Irish ancestry, he was certainly not a nationalist and had never shown interest in politics before. But Viereck apparently bought the story and saw Crowley as an eccentric oddball who hated Britain, perfect for writing outrageous material in pro-German publications. Suddenly, Aleister Crowley, the British occultist, became a writer for the fatherland, Viereck's German-funded journal, and an editor for the magazine called The International. Crowley contributed vitriolic articles under various pseudonyms, and sometimes under his own name, or magical mottos like Baphomet and Master Therion. These writings were a strange brew, part anti-British propaganda, part mystical rant. In one sarcastic piece, Crowley praised the German Zeppelin raids on London for, among other things, blowing up the office of his hated London lawyer and narrowly missing his disliked aunt's house, urging the Germans to try again and giving them her exact address. In another article, Crowley strongly urged Germany to unleash unrestricted submarine warfare on British ships, which historically they eventually did. Crowley's editorials were so bombastic and extreme that they verged on satire. It's widely believed that Crowley's real aim was to discredit the German propaganda effort by making it seem absurd. In essence, that he was a double agent doing pro-Allied work by pretending to be pro-German. This interpretation is supported by some dramatic fallout. When British authorities got wind of Crowley's writings in the fatherland, they were furious. They viewed Crowley as a traitor, committing treason in wartime. MI5 in London even raided the OTO's London headquarters, mistakenly believing that it might be linked to German espionage. Crowley's old friend, the ever-gossiping Frank Harris, wrote to Crowley letting him know that, in England, he was being crucified as a vile turncoat. Crowley, upon hearing this, chuckled. This was exactly what he had wanted. In Crowley's view, by writing ludicrous anti-British propaganda, he was actually helping Britain. How so? Well, one of his pieces concerning the sinking of the Lusitania, which happened in May of 1915, when a German U-boat torpedoed the passenger liner, Crowley penned a poem, or ritual, calling the Lusitania sinking a sacrificial rite. He later claimed that this inflammatory take on the Lusitania outraged American public opinion and contributed to the U.S. deciding to join the war effort on the Allied side. Crowley felt that he had cleverly goaded the Americans to war by being so ostentatiously pro-German that Americans recoiled. In 1917, the U.S. did indeed enter World War I against Germany, though to be fair, many factors led to this. Crowley's propaganda was at best a footnote. Nonetheless, Crowley quipped that he deserved the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor, for his covert aid to the Allies. By 1916, however, Crowley's situation in New York was precarious. He was living in relative poverty and had alienated many with his antics. But one sphere still welcomed him: the artistic, the avant-garde community. During these years, Crowley befriended various writers, artists, and even a few future legends, like the photographer Man Ray and the novelist Sinclair Lewis. There are anecdotes of Crowley in Greenwich Village salons, reading poetry, or performing magic tricks. Crowley also took up painting more seriously and held a gallery of exhibition of his artworks in New York in 1917. The results were mixed. Critics found his paintings as bizarre as his reputation. Notably, in 1918, Crowley undertook what he called the Amalantra working in New York, a series of sex magic rituals aimed at opening a portal of communication to non-human entities. In these visions, aided by hashish and opium, Crowley and his partner at the time, Roddy Minor, supposedly made contact with various cosmic intelligences. One of the supposed results of this working was a vision of a strange extraterrestrial being named Lamb, which Crowley drew. Lamb eerily resembled what we would now call a gray alien, with a large bald head and big eyes. Some occult historians consider this to be one of the first alien motifs in modern esoterica, though Crowley himself thought of Lamb as perhaps a manifestation of his holy guardian angel or a messenger thereof. As World War I drew to a close in late 1918, Crowley's American interlude was also winding down. He had managed to survive, barely, through writing, odd jobs, and the charity of some students he had gathered. He even designed elaborate ads seeking patrons or freaks to model for him, showing his desperation for creative fuel and income. One bright spot during this time, however, was Crowley's meeting of Leah Herzig, who had become the most celebrated Scarlet Woman of his later life. Leah was a Swiss-American teacher who had read Crowley's works and was intrigued. They met in New York around 1918 or 1919. Their first encounter was dramatic. Leah and her sister visited Crowley's studio, and without a word, Crowley strode up to Leah and passionately kissed her for an uncomfortably long time. Instead of being offended, Leah felt a thrilling submission to this strange man. She recalled actually enjoying being practically ravished by the Master Therion as a first greeting. Soon Leah was deeply involved with Crowley, becoming his lover and student. Crowley painted Leah nude. She famously asked him to paint her as a dead soul, a phrase that captures her morbid romance with him. In short order, Crowley initiated Leah through his rituals, and one day, he drew a magical circle on the floor, made Leah kneel in it naked, and performed the banishing ritual of the pentagram around her. Then, through an act of ritual sex, he formally consecrated her as his new Scarlet Woman, naming her alternatively Alostrial and Leah Herzig, guardian of the OTO to the 9th degree. Leah had a 2-year-old son from a prior marriage, and despite that encumbrance, she was eager to throw herself into Crowley's work. In 1919, as soon as transatlantic travel was feasible after the war, Crowley left America, accompanied by Leah and her toddler. Also joining them was Nanette Shumway, an American woman who had befriended Leah on the ship. Nanette was a single mother too, looking for adventure in post-war Europe, and Crowley promptly hired her as a governess, and soon turned her into a lover as well. Crowley's plan was grandiose. He wanted to establish a spiritual commune, a temple of Thelema, where he and most of his devoted followers could live and practice magic freely. After a short stint in Paris in 1920, he found the perfect location, a secluded villa in a coastal village in Sicily. In spring of 1920, Crowley, Leah, Nanette, and their children moved into this villa and declared it the Abbey of Thelema. Thus began one of the most infamous chapters of Crowley's life, the Cefalù commune, which would both fulfill many of his dreams and bring about some of his worst scandals. In the Abbey of Thelema, Crowley could finally live like the great beast 666, full-time, far from prying neighbors or authorities, at least for a while. Little did he know that within just a few years, this paradise of do what thou wilt would collapse in tragedy and banishment. In the spring of 1920, Aleister Crowley, now in his mid-40s, arrived in the sleepy Sicilian village of Cefalù with great expectations. He had with him his Scarlet Woman, Leah Herzig, another lover disciple, Nanette Shumway, and their children, Leah's young son and Nanette's infant daughter. They rented a simple one-story farmhouse on the outskirts of town, perched on a hill overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. This would be the Abbey of Thelema, a utopian community where Crowley's law of do what thou wilt was the sole authority. Crowley fancifully listed himself and Leah on the lease as Sir Aleister de Courval and Countess Leah Harcourt, adding a touch of nobility to their otherwise ragtag exodus. Life at the Abbey was a radical social experiment. Each day was structured around ritual and magical practice. In the mornings, the small group would don robes and gather outdoors to salute the sun at dawn. Crowley, whom everyone now addressed as Master or Therion, would carry a sword or ritual dagger, while Leah, Nanette, and any other women would carry chalices. Facing east, they would recite the Liber Resh, short prayers acknowledging the sun's station in the sky. This was followed by the Kabbalistic cross, a brief invocation drawing divine light into oneself. They repeated similar solar adorations at noon, sunset, and midnight daily. The rest of the day at the Abbey was far from conventional. Crowley encouraged an atmosphere of complete freedom and truthfulness to one's impulses, no matter how base. The walls were soon covered in murals that Crowley painted, startling frescoes of gods, demons, and erotica. The Abbey's mantra was, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," and they took it literally. Sex was a sacrament. Crowley, Leah, and Nanette engaged in group sex rituals regularly, often in the evenings. Sometimes local visitors or curious passerby, whom Crowley dubbed aspirants, were invited to participate. Crowley had no compunction about matters like marital status or gender. All that mattered was the magical fervor brought to the act. By this time, Crowley had also picked up a severe drug habit. He was addicted to heroin, which he initially used to manage his asthma. At the Abbey, he continued using heroin and also cocaine, believing these substances could expand one's consciousness. Or perhaps he was simply unable to quit them, as he often lamented in private journals. Discipline at the Abbey was unorthodox. For instance, to train the ego out of his disciples, Crowley imposed a rule that no one could use the pronoun I. Referring to oneself was forbidden. If anyone slipped up and said I, they were required to cut themselves immediately with a razor on the upper arm as penance. Crowley himself was exempt from this rule, as the I referred to the ego, and presumably the master had transcended ego, or simply because he was in charge. The women and any followers found it incredibly challenging. One of the residents, Raoul Loveday, a young Englishman who joined the Abbey later in 1922, took this practice to heart, and soon his arms and torso were crisscrossed with bloody cuts. Betty May, Raoul's wife, who accompanied him but remained skeptical, watched in horror as her husband's flesh was gradually covered in self-inflicted wounds. Crowley's interpersonal philosophy at the Abbey was captured in a witty remark he later made. "I found having 2 wives is a problem. They grew insanely jealous of each other, whereas with 3 wives, the problem is different. 2 of them will gang up and compare notes while you're with the 3rd. 4 wives is ideal because that makes a crowd, and a crowd can be neglected." This cynical quip actually reflected the tensions growing between Leia and Nanette. Initially, Leia Hersig was the acknowledged primary partner, the high priestess of the Abbey as it were, titled the Scarlet Woman. But Nanette, younger and also devoted to Crowley, began vying for his attention. By late 1920, both women were pregnant with Crowley's children. Leia gave birth to a daughter, whom they nicknamed Poupée. In January of 1920 in Paris, just before moving to Cefalù, Nanette became pregnant later that year after settling in at the Abbey. Tragedy soon struck. Baby Poupée Crowley, not yet a year old, fell ill during the summer of 1920. The Sicilian heat, primitive conditions, there was no running water or real sanitation there at the Abbey, and perhaps malnutrition or infection made the infant sickly. Crowley's diaries from that period indicate that Poupée developed a gastrointestinal illness. The child's condition worsened despite whatever basic care they could offer. Finally, in October of 1920, Leia took Poupée to the hospital in Palermo. There, on October 12th of 1920, Crowley's own 45th birthday, baby Poupée died. The death devastated Leia Hersig. To make matters worse, within days, Leia miscarried her 2nd pregnancy. She had conceived again very shortly after Poupée's birth. In the grief and blame that followed, Nanette Shumway became a target. Leia discovered entries in Nanette's diary, or so she claimed, that suggested Nanette had been secretly performing witchcraft, casting spells or curses, aiming at Leia and her baby. Leia, already emotionally unbalanced from the loss, believed Nanette had magically contributed to Poupée's death and her miscarriage. Crowley, upon hearing this, flew into a rage. He reportedly vomited in disgust, and then conducted a full exorcism ritual in the Abbey's temple to banish any evil spirits Nanette might have summoned. He berated Nanette for her pathetic bourgeois sorcery that was beneath a true Thelemite. For a time, he even expelled Nanette from the Abbey's main house. However, with 2 small children, Nanette's own child, and Leia's surviving son from before Crowley, practical need forced some reconciliation. Nanette was eventually allowed back, but the dynamic had soured. Nanette became increasingly obsessed with Crowley and resentful of Leia's formal status. Life at the Abbey continued in its peculiar rhythms. New people came and went. The Italian locals regarded the Crowley troupe with suspicion. They nicknamed Crowley Il Diavolo di Cefalù, or the Devil of Cefalù, due to his unorthodox activities and wild-eyed appearance. Remarkably, an American woman and aspiring actress named Jane Wolfe arrived in 1921 to study under Crowley. She had been a silent film actress in Hollywood, but left that behind for occult study. Jane Wolfe's diaries from her time at the Abbey provide some outside perspective on the daily goings-on. She noted Crowley's heroin use and the sexual ceremonies, but she herself, being older and perhaps less attractive to Crowley, took a more observational role. By late 1922, however, the Abbey of Thelema would gain international notoriety through a tragic event and its aftermath. A young Oxford graduate, Raoul Loveday, had come to Cefalù with his wife Betty May in November of 1922. Raoul was an idealistic 23-year-old who admired Crowley's poetry and philosophy. Betty May was a vivacious London brunette, a nightclub dancer and model, who was skeptical of Crowley, but accompanied her husband out of loyalty. Raoul quickly embraced Crowley's creed, following every rule and suggestion. Betty, on the other hand, found the Abbey repellent. She later described it as filthy, with cats and dogs roaming freely, children not well cared for, and an atmosphere of moral depravity. For 2 months, the couple endured life at the Abbey. Raoul participated eagerly in all rituals. Crowley took a liking to him, and even started writing a hymn in his honor. But things took a dark turn. As mentioned, Raoul rigorously practiced the no saying I rule until his body was covered in cuts. Crowley also supplied him with drugs, hashish and opium, which Raoul consumed in quantities perhaps his system wasn't used to. Perhaps most infamously, Raoul agreed to take part in one of Crowley's more bizarre sacramental rituals, the consumption of cat blood. Crowley had killed a cat as part of a ritual invocation. Crowley hated cats, ironically, despite there being strays around, and collected its blood in a chalice. Raoul, to prove his devotion, drank the warm blood. Shortly after this, he fell violently ill. It's likely he contracted some waterborne or foodborne illness, possibly typhoid fever or a similar infection, exacerbated by a diet at the Abbey that included unpasteurized goat's milk and unhygienic conditions. As Raoul's fever climbed, he became bedridden in early February of 1923. Betty May grew frantic. She had no money of her own to summon a doctor or to move him to a hospital. Crowley had required them to turn over most of their cash on arrival as a donation. Crowley, absorbed in his magical work, insisted that the illness could be handled with occult means and limited care. A local physician was supposed to come, but he either wasn't called in time or refused once he heard who the patient was. Betty later said that the mystic, Crowley, kept assuring her that a doctor would call, but none arrived. As Raoul worsened, Betty decided to defy Crowley and seek help. She wanted to contact the British consul in Palermo, essentially the nearest UK diplomatic official, to get Raoul rescued. When Crowley got wind of this, he became enraged. According to Betty, Crowley and Leia forced her to sign a letter swearing that she would not alert authorities. They threatened to throw her out of the Abbey immediately if she disobeyed. Poor Betty was isolated, terrified of being expelled and leaving her husband behind. On February 16th of 1923, Raoul Loveday died at the Abbey of Thelema. Crowley performed a simple funeral for him, carrying Raoul's body to a plot just outside the Abbey grounds. He reportedly buried him near a farmer's field, since the church cemetery was off limits. Betty May, now a widow at age 22, was traumatized and furious. She escaped Cefalù as soon as she could travel, and by late February of 1923, she was back in London. And she lost no time in telling her sensational story to the press. The British tabloids went into overdrive. The Sunday Express and the John Bull magazine ran multi-part exposés on Crowley in March and April of 1923. They dubbed him the wickedest man in the world and the king of depravity, and even, in lurid imaginative leaps, accused him of cannibalism. One false claim was that during a Himalayan expedition, Crowley had deliberately caused the death of 2 porters and then had eaten them to survive. The press painted the Abbey of Thelema as a chamber of horrors, an inferno, a maelstrom of filth and obscenity, as one article put it. They printed every salacious detail Betty provided. The cat blood drinking, the orgies, the shocking living conditions. Crowley was labeled not just a black magician, but a sexual predator and murderer. One headline thundered that Crowley was the man we'd most like to hang. The propaganda storm did not go unnoticed in Italy. Benito Mussolini, Italy's dictator, had no love for scandalous foreigners corrupting the youth of attracting negative international press to his country. Under instructions from Rome, the police in Cefalù were ordered to expel Crowley. On April 23, 1923, the local authorities served Crowley with an expulsion notice. He was given a few days to leave Italy. On May 1, 1923, the Great Beast 666 and Leah Herzig boarded a ship from Palermo and left Sicily behind. The Abbey of Thelema was closed. It would later fall into ruin, never to be officially inhabited again. Crowley considered this a temporary setback, but in truth, it marked the end of an era. The Cefalù experiment had been the fullest expression of this Thelemic ideal in practice, and its notoriety ensured he would never again be allowed such freedom by authorities. The remaining devotees at the Abbey scattered. Nanette Shumway went briefly to Germany and then faded from history. Her child by Crowley was sent to live with relatives, and Nanette herself eventually died in obscurity. Leah Herzig, once Crowley's closest confidant, was left psychologically broken by the loss of her baby and the collapse of the Abbey. She wandered Europe, at one point living destitute on the streets of Paris, addicted to drugs, and even resorting to prostitution to survive. Eventually, Leah renounced Crowley completely. She had begun a conversion to Roman Catholicism, and in later decades lived quietly in the United States as a churchgoer, a far cry from the wild ape of Thoth she had been in 1920. For Crowley, the mid-1920s were indeed a wilderness, branded the most evil man by the British press, hounded out of Italy, nearly penniless, and in failing health from years of drug abuse. He drifted around Europe looking for refuge. He called these his exile or wandering years, though public opinion thought of them as the deserved downfall of a scoundrel. After his expulsion from Italy in 1923, Aleister Crowley became essentially a wanderer. He liked to say that he was living in exile, like Napoleon on Elba, though in truth, he was more adrift than plotting a triumphant return. He spent time in Tunisia, then settled for a while in Paris, subsisting on the generosity of friends and admirers. One such friend was the ever-supportive Frank Harris, the Irish writer who had earlier employed Crowley in New York. Harris now lived in France with his mistress, Nellie O'Hara. In 1924, Harris took pity on Crowley and let him stay at his villa. By chance, Nellie had invited her close friend Pauline Pierce, an American socialite, and the wife of a wealthy publisher, Marvin Pierce. Thus, under one roof in Paris were four individuals: Crowley, Frank Harris, Nellie, and Pauline Pierce. This convergence has given birth to one of the most tantalizing footnotes in Crowley lore, and indeed, in conspiracy. Crowley was, during this period, attempting what he considered the ultimate magical attainment, the grade of Ipsimus, which in occult terms means something like the highest of high, one who has completed the great work and is united with the divine. According to Crowley's diaries and later accounts by others, he undertook a supreme ordeal in 1924 to crown his Ipsimus realization. The outline of this ordeal was unorthodox to say the least. It required Crowley to be sexually exhausted and then stimulated in every way possible by multiple partners, using every trick and aphrodisiac known. In effect, it was a kind of ritualized orgy intended to push the candidate beyond all physical limits into a state of spiritual transcendence. If Crowley indeed carried out this rite in Paris, It's likely that Nellie O'Hara and Pauline Pierce were among the experienced attendants facilitating it. Crowley never named the participants in his published accounts, but the timing and his living situations hint strongly at their involvement. According to later speculation, Pauline Pierce's role may have been more than just an assistant. After returning to the U.S. in October of 1924, Pauline gave birth 8 months later, on June 8th of 1925, to a baby girl named Barbara. That girl grew up to be Barbara Pierce, who married George Herbert Walker Bush and became Barbara Bush, the First Lady of the United States and mother of President George W. Bush. The timeline and circumstances have led to a juicy conspiracy theory that Barbara Bush was Crowley's biological daughter, conceived during these ritual weeks in Paris. There is no direct evidence to confirm this. Barbara's birth was legitimate and Marvin Pierce is recorded as her father, but the mere possibility that the most wickedest man in the world could be the grandfather of a president was just too interesting for some to pass up. Crowley himself never mentioned it. He likely never knew or cared what became of Pauline's child. But the story persists in modern lore as an example of how Crowley's strange life intersects with mainstream history in surprising ways. Amid these intrigues, Crowley also continued his involvement with the OTO. In 1925, after the death of Theodore Roos, Crowley was informally recognized by German OTO members as the Order's international head. The Germans knew of Crowley's scandalous reputation. One OTO leader even referred to him as a flesh-eating devil in jest, but they also appreciated how he spread Thelema and invigorated the Order. Crowley took on grand titles like Outer Head of the Order and continued to use his magical name, Baphomet, for OTO affairs. He set up a new lodge in London when he returned there later in the decade and integrated the OTO with his Thelemic teachings thoroughly. By the late 1920s, Crowley's fortunes saw a minor upswing thanks to a young disciple who would later be crucial in preserving Crowley's legacy, Israel Regardie. Regardie was a British Jewish occult student who idolized Crowley's writings, though he later became critical. On October 12th of 1928, Crowley's 53rd birthday, Regardie arrived in Paris to apprentice under him. Regardie had saved some money and perhaps had family money as well, and Crowley wasted no time in relieving him of it. As Regardie later recounted with a mix of humor and bitterness, on the very night that he met Crowley and Crowley's then mistress, a Nicaraguan woman named Maria de Miramar, whom Crowley had impulsively married, the great beast asked, "Got any money on you?" Regardie, eager to please, handed over all of the cash in his wallet. He never saw it again, he said, though he mused that what he had learned from Crowley was worth the cost. Indeed, Regardie served as Crowley's secretary and student, working closely with him over the next few years. During this period, Crowley finally published his masterwork, Magick in Theory and Practice, part of a larger work simply called Magick, which incorporated Book 4 in 1929. This book systematically laid out Crowley's magical system and rituals. It was a milestone, the first comprehensive textbook of occult practice from a modern perspective, and it has influenced occultists ever since. Crowley was overjoyed. Not only did he have a major new book out, but he had a small stream of funds and a devout new Scarlet Woman. However, once again, Crowley's notorious reputation caught up with him. In 1929 to 1930, he settled in Paris with Regardie and Maria, running a small office for the OTO and writing. The French authorities, hearing of this, were not keen to host him for long. Perhaps due to British pressure or local concerns, the French police paid Crowley a visit in 1929. The result was that Crowley, Maria, and Israel were abruptly served an order to leave France within 24 hours or face imprisonment. Crowley was stunned. He loved Paris and wanted to stay to relish the publicity of his newly published book. In a crafty move, he hatched a plan to circumvent the expulsion. Crowley got a sympathetic doctor to diagnose him with something, perhaps bronchitis or even a heart condition, and declare him unfit for travel. Meanwhile, he packed Rigardi and Maria off to London, instructing them to find lodgings for him there. Rigardi wryly noted that Crowley just wanted to bask a bit in being the cause of a diplomatic fuss, but eventually, he too left Paris under the medical exemption a short while later. Back in London in the early 1930s, Crowley attempted to rehabilitate, or at least reintroduce himself into society. To some extent, he succeeded in circulating among bohemian and literary circles. Despite everything, Crowley was still an interesting dinner guest. He found patrons in unexpected places. For example, Nancy Cunard, the heiress to a shipping fortune and a poet, was briefly enamored with Crowley's charisma. She and other socialites invited Crowley to luncheons and gatherings, curious about his philosophy. Crowley enjoyed a second wind of mingling with the respectable art world. At one point, he was even invited to speak about occult philosophy at a literary luncheon sponsored by a London bookseller in 1932. It seemed for a moment that perhaps Crowley could pivot to being seen as an eccentric writer rather than a fiend. But any veneer of respectability soon cracked. Most of these new acquaintances swiftly distanced themselves once they realized Crowley was either trying to get them to pay his bills or making sexual advances that alarmed them. The bohemian libertines of the 1930s had their limits, and Crowley, in his late 50s now, ravaged by years of drug use, was not quite the charming decadent he had once been. Then came the final nail in Crowley's public reputation, the Nina Hamnet libel trial of 1934. Nina Hamnet was an artist and writer who had known Crowley in the 1910s. In 1932, she published an autobiography titled Laughing Torso, in which she mentioned Crowley and the Abbey of Thelema, suggesting that Crowley practiced black magic and that a child had disappeared under mysterious circumstances on Cefalù. These were implied references to the tragedies of the Abbey, Raoul's death and perhaps an earlier infant death. But Hamnet's tone was humorous and gossipy. Crowley, ever litigious when insulted, sued Hamnet and her publisher for libel in 1934. He contended that her insinuations of human sacrifice and black magic were false and damaging. The trial was a media sensation. Crowley foolishly took the stand in his own defense, which allowed the opposing counsel to interrogate him before the jury. The courtroom drama was extraordinary. Crowley admitted unabashedly to the titles of the Beast 666 and Master Therion, explaining that Therion meant Great Wild Beast. When asked if those titles reflected his real life, he quipped, "The Beast 666 only means sunlight. You can call me Little Sunshine," which provoked laughter throughout the court. Such flippancy did not endear him to the judge. The prosecutor read aloud passages from Crowley's writings and included some of the most blasphemous and lewd to establish his character. The judge, Mr. Justice Swift, was utterly appalled. In his summing up, he delivered a scathing denouncement. "I've been engaged in the administration of the law for over 40 years, and I thought I knew every conceivable form of wickedness. But I have learned in this case that we can always learn something more if we live long enough. I've never heard such dreadful, horrible, blasphemous stuff as that which has been produced by the man who describes himself as the greatest living poet." With those words, any slim chance Crowley had of winning evaporated. The jury found against him. Crowley lost the libel case and was ordered to pay a substantial cost. The financial blow of the trial was devastating. Already deeply in debt, Crowley was forced into bankruptcy in 1935. Bailiffs seized his belongings. Crowley's name was splashed across the tabloids again, now as a pathetic figure, bankrupt, discredited, essentially labeled in the court as the wickedest man alive by a judge's remarks. After this, Crowley never again had any real influence or mainstream engagement. He retreated into relative obscurity. However, he did not stop working or influencing the occult subculture. In the late 1930s, he mentored a new generation of British occultists, including Gerald Gardner, who would later found Wicca. It's said that during World War II, Crowley and Ian Fleming, then an intelligence officer, cooked up the idea for Winston Churchill to use the V for victory hand sign as a magical antidote to the Nazi swastika, a claim Crowley made and some historians find plausible, since Fleming did know of Crowley through mutual contacts, and Crowley did mention the idea in a letter. There were rumors that Crowley might be tapped to interview Nazi Deputy Rudolf Hess after Hess's bizarre solo flight to Britain in 1941. Hess was deeply into astrology and the occult, but that meeting never happened. Fleming did involve Crowley peripherally. It's hinted that Crowley supplied some references or advice on how to handle Hess's occult beliefs, but MI5 ultimately chose not to bring Crowley face to face with Hess. Another notable intersection with history was Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard in the early 1940s. Jack Parsons, a brilliant rocket scientist in California, was an enthusiastic follower of Crowley's Thelema and led an OTO lodge in Pasadena. In 1946, Parsons undertook a series of sex magic rituals known as the Babylon Working, and his scryer in those rites was a then unknown L. Ron Hubbard, who would later found Scientology. Hubbard and Parsons attempted to incarnate a goddess figure, and ironically, Hubbard ended up running off with Parsons' girlfriend and money. Crowley, hearing about these goings-on via letters from Parsons, was skeptical of Hubbard. He called him a fraud in one letter, and warned Parsons that he was being duped. Hubbard would later claim that he infiltrated the OTO to break up black magic, a likely cover story. This strange footnote shows how Crowley's influence seeped into early sci-fi and space-age culture via Parsons and Hubbard. By 1945, with World War II over, Crowley was a worn-out figure. He spent his final years living in a boarding house called Netherwood in Hastings, a seaside town in southern England. Wrecked by chronic bronchitis, heroin addiction, and the general ravages of age and vice, Crowley was a shell of his former self. Visitors in his last year found him sometimes still witty and sharp, and at other times bitter and paranoid. He had outlived most of his contemporaries, and certainly outlived his reputation. Younger people hardly knew who he was, except as an old scandal. On December 1st of 1947, Aleister Crowley died at Netherwood from respiratory failure, aggravated by pleurisy and heart disease. He was 72 years old. His doctor reported that Crowley's last words were, "I am perplexed." It's a curious epitaph. The great beast at the end of his life, still puzzled by the ultimate questions of existence. Crowley's funeral was held on December 5th in 1947 at Brighton Crematorium Chapel. Only a dozen or so people attended. Among them were his son, Aleister Crowley, born from a later liaison, a few loyal Thelemites, and former students like Kenneth Grant. In a final act of defiance, the service included readings from Crowley's own works. Passages from the Gnostic Mass and his hymn to Pan were recited aloud. One line read was, "I rave and I rape, and I rip and I rend, everlasting, world without end," from the hymn to Pan. This caused an uproar in the press afterward. Tabloids called it a black mass funeral and splashed headlines like, "Farewell to the Great 666, condemning the ceremony. Thus, was Aleister Crowley sent off into the hereafter amidst scandal to the last. His ashes were sent to an American disciple in New Jersey, who reportedly sprinkled them into a garden of a home in Hampton, New Jersey, where they remain mingled with the soil to this day. Aleister Crowley's life is a saga unlike any other, a tale of genius and excess, enlightenment and depravity, fame and infamy. He sought to push the boundaries of human experience in every direction: spiritual, sexual, physical, and in doing so became a legendary figure of both celebration and condemnation. In the end, his prophecy, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," which so shocked his contemporaries, has echoed through Western culture, influencing secret societies, modern pagan religions, literature, music, and philosophy. He lived as he died, unapologetically perplexing, a self-declared beast in pursuit of his own true will. Crowley once wrote, "The joy of life consists in the exercise of one's energies, continual growth, constant change, and the enjoyment of every new experience." By that metric, however, society may judge good or evil. Aleister Crowley indeed succeeded in living life to the fullest measure of the extreme. The man whom the press vilified as the wickedest man in the world carved for himself an indelible place in 20th century history, a figure of dark fascination whose story continues to be retold as a cautionary and compelling chronicle of the occult and the human spirit. Crowley's life was so vast and has so many details that I'm sure I missed a few things, and there are no doubt honorable mention details, so don't be too mad if I didn't capture absolutely every single detail, although I certainly did my best. But before we go, I did want to share my own personal experience from when I visited Scotland last year and had the honor of visiting Loch Ness as well as Boleskin Cemetery. Loch Ness, for those of you who don't know, is pretty large, and it takes several hours to drive around. Now, I wanted to visit Boleskine House, but it was closed when I was there for renovations. I believe it's owned by a historic society now known as the Boleskine House Foundation. Where the house is located, it's up on a hill, and down the hill is a narrow road, and down another hill is a set of stairs that you use to enter the cemetery. There were a fair amount of old tombstones, from what I recall, and it's arguably probably the oldest cemetery that I've ever personally visited. One thing I did notice, though, is that there was a dream catcher or something similar on this gorgeous rowan tree, and straight past the tree, one overlooks Loch Ness. I remember filming various footage for this exact documentary then, and very interestingly, I remember standing there and thinking to myself, I'm inadvertently following in the footsteps of the great beast. And at about that time, I felt a cold rush of wind surge past me, and it vibrated the tree before me. And I remember getting just full-body chills in that moment. Shortly after, I packed up my camera, and since we had limited time there, and started heading back towards our vehicle, which was being driven by Meg's sister at the time. And as we went back up the stairs, headed towards the road, there was a large storm which had seemingly come in from out of nowhere above us. To me, it was just very interesting, to say the least. Boleskin, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, after Crowley was purchased by Jimmy Page, the guitarist for Led Zeppelin in the 1970s. It suffered two fires, one in 2015 and another in 2019, and is now in the care of that historic society, the Boleskine House Foundation. A last notable mention from me of Crowley's influence in one of the least expected places is actually within the game Old School RuneScape. As someone who's played since 2002 and continues to play to this day, albeit it was RuneScape 2 back then, Crowley's escapades have seemed to influence the game in multiple ways. In the quest Desert Treasure, which one completes to obtain the ancient magic spellbook, which was and is still sick in my opinion, contains segments both within Great Pyramids as well as desert rituals. You even battle various demons and magicians using the ancient spell books throughout. There's definitely a lot of, knowing what I know now, I can see it so much more. And if you know what I'm talking about, then it'll make sense. But if not, it's still an honorable mention, no doubt. You can even look into other parts of the game, even outside of that particular quest. I mean, in another quest, I believe you actually have to defeat the demon Choronzon, which again is very interesting to say the least. It's something I noticed, or a few details I noticed, and I don't think it's been pointed out by anyone else up until this point. Crowley is truly an enigmatic figure, one that has arguably done more for the study of magic than maybe anyone else. But yet at the same time, he's such an abhorrent, yet mesmerizing figure simultaneously. I think his life truly does showcase the duality of man, and like his last words, by concluding his story now, I too am perplexed. Thank you guys so very much for your incredible amount of patience with this one. It ended up being so much longer than I had originally anticipated, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. I think it might be the longest video that I've made to date, and one that I've been wanting to make and do for years now. In any regard, if you enjoyed it, click the like button, share it around with friends or on the internet here, on social media. Subscribe if you're new here. And if you are new here or you're not new here, make sure to turn on notifications so that you never miss a new upload. You can watch all of my content ad-free by becoming a channel member here on YouTube by clicking join, or you can visit patreon.com/mysteryarchives if you want to support my work there, where you can also watch my content ad-free. That includes marathons, by the way, folks. Or if you want to get yourself something cool or check out some of my books, which I have 3 books now. I'll have a 4th out around Halloween time this year, 2025 in October. So look forward to that for sure. You can visit mysteryarchives.myshopify.com. Other than that, guys, I'm going to do a bit of a return to form. It's been a while since I've covered some really, really good hauntings, and I'm very much planning a ton of those out just now. Just given how long production takes, you know, again, I will always and probably eternally be asking for your patience, and I don't take it for granted. But just so you know, I truly, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, I truly appreciate you guys for allowing me to be able to do this for a living. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully express just how much that means to me. But I appreciate you guys so very much. Again, I really hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it's one of the most extensive videos or documentaries or documentary episodes covering Crowley that you've come across. And I just hope that overall I did the story justice. So with that being said, guys, this has been Cody here at Mystery Archives. Make sure to please stay safe out there from demons and crazy people and cults and all of the above. And I'll see you next time. Take care.